A millionaire widow with no children always ate alone. Until the nanny's black son sat down next to her and, "That child should not be here during your dinner, ma'am." Margaret Pierce's harsh voice cut through the solemn silence of the dining room like a sharp blade. Victoria Whitmore, 72, paused with her fork suspended in the air, watching the scene unfold before her eyes. Kevin, only 8 years old, the son of Carmen, her faithful housekeeper, had shyly sat down in the chair next to hers at the mahogany table that could seat 16, but for years had served only one. Margaret Pierce, sister of Victoria's late husband and self-proclaimed guardian of family tradition, pointed an accusing finger at the boy. "Carmen, control your son. He has no manners to be at the table with the adults." Little Kevin lowered his head, his little hands nervously clutching the napkin he had carefully placed on his lap. Carmen rushed out of the kitchen, her face red with embarrassment and terror. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Victoria. Kevin, come here now." But Victoria raised her hand, stopping Carmen from approaching. Her blue-gray eyes fixed on Margaret with a coldness that would make winter seem warm. "Stop right there, Carmen." Victoria had built a real estate empire alongside her husband, but after his death 3 years earlier, she had completely isolated herself. The giant table had become her lonely throne, where she silently chewed her loneliness along with tasteless meals. Margaret smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Finally showing some sense of decorum, Victoria. These people need to know their place." "Kevin," Victoria said, completely ignoring Margaret, "you may stay. In fact, I would very much enjoy your company at dinner." The shock on Margaret's face was instantaneous. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. As the unofficial chair of the family council and the primary beneficiary of Victoria's will, she was not accustomed to being contradicted. "Victoria, this is unacceptable. What will the neighbors say? You are allowing," she paused dramatically, looking Kevin up and down, "this child to sit at our table." Victoria chewed her piece of salmon slowly, watching Kevin, who had relaxed slightly but still kept his eyes downcast. There was something about the boy's quiet dignity that touched a dormant chord in her heart of stone. "Margaret," Victoria said finally, her voice low but laden with authority, "this is my house and my table. Kevin is welcome here." Margaret Pierce stormed out of the room, but Victoria noticed the calculating look in her eyes. She knew that look. It was the same one Margaret had worn during the reading of her husband's will, when she discovered she would inherit nothing as long as Victoria was alive. As Kevin smiled shyly and began to eat, Victoria could not have imagined that this simple meal had just signed a declaration of war. Margaret Pierce would not tolerate a black child threatening her position in the family, let alone her $1 million inheritance. What Victoria also didn't know was that Margaret had been secretly watching every move in the house, waiting for the right moment to act. And now, finally, she had found the perfect ammunition for her sinister plans. If you feel that this story will stir your emotions and reveal a twist that no one expects, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how an innocent meal would become the catalyst for a battle that would change all the lives involved forever. 3 days after that dinner, Margaret Pierce returned to the Whitmore mansion with a brown leather briefcase and an expression that could freeze hell. This time, she did not come alone. David Wellington, the family lawyer for 2 decades, accompanied her with a solemn air that foreshadowed a storm. "Victoria, we need to talk," Margaret announced, planting herself in the velvet armchair in the living room as if she owned the place. "It's about this inappropriate situation you're allowing in your home." Victoria continued embroidering quietly, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. Kevin played quietly in the corner of the room with some wooden blocks she had given him, while Carmen discreetly tidied the bookshelf. "David has brought some interesting documents," Margaret continued, opening her briefcase. "Did you know that allowing employees and their families to live on the property inappropriately could invalidate certain clauses in your will?" The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Whitmore, technically there are some legal interpretations that could be questioned if there were allegations that you are not maintaining the family's traditional standards." Victoria finally looked up from her embroidery. "Interesting how you all care so much about family traditions, considering Margaret barely visited when my husband was alive." "How dare you!" Margaret slammed her fist on the coffee table. "Robert trusted me to look after the family estate after his death. And that includes ensuring you maintain the dignity of this house." At that moment, Kevin accidentally knocked over a block, which rolled across the marble floor with a soft thud. Margaret turned to him like a viper ready to strike. "You see," she hissed. "He can't even play quietly." This child is turning this respectable house into a slum daycare center. Carmen stepped forward, her fists clenched. My son isn't bothering anyone, ma'am. Your son, Margaret spat the word like venom, shouldn't be in the same room as us. You two are confusing temporary kindness with permanent rights. Victoria watched the scene with apparent calm, but internally something had changed. She had known Margaret long enough to recognize that expression. It was the same face she had made as a young girl when she destroyed other children's dolls at the social club, pure malice disguised as moral superiority. David, Victoria said coldly, do you really believe there is legal basis to question how I run my own household? The lawyer hesitated. Well, there are precedents when there are allegations of undue influence over estate decisions. Undue influence? Victoria laughed, an icy sound. From an 8-year-old child. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes shining with malice. Victoria, you're being manipulated. That woman, she pointed at Carmen, brought her son here deliberately. She knows you're alone, vulnerable, and she's using that child to gain your sympathy and secure a privileged position in the family. That's a lie, Carmen exploded, tears of anger streaming down her face. I've worked honestly in this house for 2 years. I've never asked for anything but my salary. Of course you wouldn't ask directly, Margaret smiled cruelly. But letting your son seduce a lonely widow? It's a very clever plan, I must admit. Victoria put her embroidery aside and stood up slowly. When she spoke, her voice had a dangerous tone that Margaret didn't recognize. Margaret, you just accused Carmen of using her own son to manipulate me. That's a very serious accusation. It's the truth. Margaret insisted. And if you don't take action now, I'll be forced to protect the family's interests by other means. The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin had stopped playing and was watching the adults with wide, confused eyes. Carmen trembled with contained indignation. And Victoria. Victoria had a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Other means, she repeated softly. How exactly? Margaret lifted her chin defiantly. There are institutions that specialize in caring for elderly people who may be making inappropriate decisions due to isolation. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Victoria looked at David, who avoided her gaze, and then at Margaret, who stared back at her with triumphant arrogance. I see, Victoria said finally. So you're suggesting that I be declared incompetent because I decided to have dinner with a child? If necessary, Margaret replied without hesitation. At that moment, observing the cold cruelty in Margaret's eyes, Victoria realized that she had seriously underestimated her sister-in-law's ambition. But what Margaret couldn't see was that, for the first time in years, Victoria felt something she had completely forgotten, the pleasure of intellectual battle. Each new threat only fueled a quiet determination that grew within her, a strength that had lain dormant since she built her business empire alongside her husband. What those prejudiced people didn't know was that every word of contempt was writing their own defeat, because no one who truly knew Victoria Whitmore would dare to underestimate a woman who had destroyed competitors far more formidable than a greedy sister-in-law. That same night, after Margaret and David left with their veiled threats echoing through the halls of the mansion, Victoria remained seated in her private office for hours. The light from the mahogany desk illuminated stacks of financial documents she hadn't reviewed since her husband's death, papers that contained secrets she herself didn't remember possessing. Carmen had put Kevin to bed and discreetly brought Victoria a cup of tea. Ma'am, are you all right? You seem worried. Victoria looked up, observing the honest face of the woman who had cared for her home with impeccable dedication for 2 years. Carmen, tell me about Margaret. What have you observed about her during your visits? Well, Carmen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable talking about her employer's sister-in-law. She always asks a lot about your routines, your medications, your mental health. Interesting. Victoria made a mental note. What about your finances? I once heard her ask Mr. David when you would be signing the new will papers. She seemed anxious. Victoria smiled coldly. Margaret had made the classic mistake of the greedy, revealing her cards too soon. Carmen, I need to tell you something important about our situation. The next morning, Victoria did something she hadn't done in years. She called Jonathan Myers, the private investigator who had helped her husband uncover attempts at industrial espionage during the construction of his real estate empire. Myers was discreet, efficient, and had a network of contacts that rivaled that of any government agency. "Mrs. Whitmore," Myers' deep voice sounded surprised over the phone. "I haven't heard your voice since Robert's funeral. How can I help you?" "Jonathan, I need you to investigate my sister-in-law Margaret Pierce, especially her finances over the last 5 years and any attempts to influence health professionals or lawyers. Do you suspect anything specific?" Victoria looked out the window, watching Kevin playing in the garden with a naturalness that contrasted sharply with the artificial tension Margaret had brought into the house. "I suspect she's orchestrating something to have me declared incompetent. And Jonathan, I want you to find out everything about her. Everything." Meanwhile, Margaret Pierce was far from idle. That afternoon, she met with Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a private psychiatrist known for his ethical flexibility when well compensated. His office was located in a discreet neighborhood, far from the prying eyes of the social elite. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Margaret said, sitting down in the leather armchair. "As we discussed on the phone, I am concerned about my sister-in-law's erratic behavior." Dr. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, leafing through a blank medical record. "Tell me about these troubling behaviors." "She is becoming inappropriately attached to the housekeeper's family, especially to a child. She is allowing them to eat dinner at the family table, giving them expensive gifts." Margaret paused dramatically. "I fear she is being manipulated in her state of prolonged grief." "And you mentioned changes to the will?" "Exactly. She has spoken of altering the distribution of her estate to include these strangers. As a physician, don't you find that indicative of mental instability?" Dr. Mitchell took careful notes. For $5,000 in cash, he would be willing to diagnose almost anything. It could be a case of premature senility or undue influence. Naturally, I would need an in-person evaluation. Margaret smiled. "That can be arranged." What Margaret didn't know was that Victoria had spent the entire afternoon at the law office of Patricia Coleman, an estate planning attorney who had built her reputation on destroying fraudulent attempts to alter wills. Coleman was known for her cunning and for never losing a case when representing the legitimate party. "Ms. Whitmore, looking at the documents you brought, I can confirm that any attempt to contest your mental capacity would be extremely difficult to sustain," Coleman said, organizing papers on the desk. "Your finances are impeccably organized, you show no signs of dementia, and most importantly, you have the absolute right to choose how to distribute your estate." Victoria nodded. "But what if they get a corrupt doctor to attest to my supposed incompetence?" "That's where it gets interesting," Coleman smiled predatorily. "Any professional who signs a false report is committing a federal crime. And if we can prove conspiracy to commit fraud," she paused significantly, "we're talking jail time, not just civil lawsuits." That night, Victoria received her first call from Jonathan Myers. "Ms. Whitmore, you were right to be suspicious. Margaret Pierce is in serious financial trouble. She has lost over $200,000 in speculative investments over the past 3 years. And there's more." Victoria settled into her chair, bracing herself for information that would confirm her darkest suspicions. She hired a lawyer specializing in challenging wills 6 months ago. The same firm that represented that famous case where they declared a widow incompetent to steal her inheritance. "And Ms. Whitmore, she's already spreading rumors about your mental health in social circles." Victoria felt a cold anger settling in her chest. It wasn't just greed, it was an orchestrated campaign to destroy her reputation and steal her autonomy. "Keep investigating, Jonathan. Especially any connections to health professionals willing to falsify diagnoses." Hanging up the phone, Victoria glanced through the office's half-open door and saw Kevin helping Carmen organize some books on the shelf. The domestic, peaceful scene contrasted brutally with the war Margaret had declared on her newly formed family. Victoria then realized that Margaret had made a fatal mistake. She had attacked not only Victoria, but the people Victoria had learned to love. And that turned an inheritance dispute into something much more dangerous, a battle for dignity, for the right to choose her own family, and for the right to live without fear of being betrayed by her own relatives. For a moment, Margaret Pierce had actually gotten what she wanted, to make Victoria feel threatened and isolated. But what that greedy woman couldn't understand was that Victoria Whitmore hadn't built an empire by bowing to intimidation. Much less would she allow anyone to use racial prejudice to destroy the first real family she had found in decades. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Margaret's last threat, Victoria was serving pancakes to Kevin when the mansion's doorbell rang insistently. Carmen peered through the window and her face instantly paled. "Miss Victoria," she whispered, "there are 3 cars. Margaret the lawyer, a man I don't know, and 2 paramedics with a stretcher." Victoria continued serving breakfast calmly, but Kevin sensed the tension in the air. "Aunt Victoria, are you all right?" "Perfectly fine, dear," she replied, kissing his forehead. "In fact, I've never been better." Margaret burst through the front door without waiting for permission, followed by David Wellington, Dr. Mitchell, whom Victoria recognized immediately from the photos Jonathan Myers had sent, and 2 embarrassed paramedics who clearly didn't want to be there. "Victoria," Margaret declared dramatically, "the time has come for you to receive the proper care you need. Dr. Mitchell, explain the situation." The psychiatrist approached with a clipboard, avoiding Victoria's direct gaze. "Ms. Whitmore, based on detailed reports of your erratic behavior and inappropriate financial decisions, I determine that you are a danger to yourself and need immediate hospitalization for psychiatric evaluation." Victoria smiled. It was the coldest smile Margaret had ever seen, and for the first time in years, she felt a chill of genuine fear. "Interesting," Victoria said, walking calmly to her coffee table and picking up a tablet. "Dr. Mitchell, would you mind repeating that loudly so everyone can hear clearly?" "I said you need immediate psychiatric hospitalization," he repeated, now more confident with Margaret's support. Victoria tapped the tablet screen. Immediately, Dr. Mitchell's own voice echoed through the room. "For $5,000 in cash, I would be willing to diagnose almost anything. I could set up a case of early senility or undue influence." The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Mitchell turned white as a sheet. Margaret felt her legs buckle. "Interesting recording, don't you think?" Victoria continued, now walking toward Margaret like a predator circling its prey. "Jonathan Myers is very efficient. He managed to record the entire conversation you had in his office last Tuesday." Margaret tried to regain her composure. That's illegal. Unauthorized recordings are not admissible as evidence." Victoria laughed, a genuinely amused sound. "Margaret, you're talking to someone who built a real estate empire. Do you really believe I don't know the laws of recording?" Jonathan was posing as a patient in an adjacent waiting room. Dr. Mitchell spoke too loudly about his criminal dealings. David Wellington took a step back, clearly calculating his chances of escaping without consequences. But Victoria wasn't finished. "But wait, there's more," she tapped the screen again. This time, it was Margaret's voice echoing through the room. "If we can get her admitted for 72 hours under psychiatric observation, we can question all of her recent decisions, including any changes to her will. Especially if those changes favor unsuitable people." Carmen gasped, finally understanding the magnitude of the conspiracy against her boss. Kevin hid behind her, frightened by the palpable tension in the air. "David," Victoria turned to the lawyer, "do you also have something to add? Or would you prefer that I play the recording where you discuss how to forge medical documents?" The lawyer was clearly panicking. "Victoria, I can explain. Margaret came to me, she said you were really sick." "Lie." Margaret exploded, realizing she was being abandoned by her own accomplices. "Victoria, you're bluffing. There's no way you could have recorded private conversations." Victoria approached her, her eyes shining with cold satisfaction. "Margaret, 30 years of building businesses has taught me one fundamental thing: always document everything. Everything." She picked up a folder from the side table and opened it, scattering documents across the sofa. "Bank reports showing your losses of $200,000 in bad investments. Conversations with real estate agents trying to sell your house in secret. Emails to David discussing strategies to declare me incompetent. And my favorite." Victoria held up a printed photo from a cell phone. Margaret talking to Dr. Mitchell in a casino parking lot, handing him an envelope. "Jonathan is really very talented with a telephoto lens." Dr. Mitchell tried to slip away discreetly, but Victoria blocked his path. "Oh, doctor, don't go yet. I'm sure the Regional Medical Board will be fascinated by your innovative practices. Especially when they learn you lost your license in 2 other states for similar conduct." The color drained completely from the doctor's face. How did you find out about that?" "The internet," Victoria said simply. It's amazing how important information remains hidden to those who don't bother to look. Margaret was now visibly desperate, sweating despite the air conditioning. All right, maybe we went too far, but that doesn't change the fact that you're being manipulated by these people. Victoria walked over to Kevin, who looked at her with admiration and a little confusion, and placed her hand affectionately on his shoulder. Manipulated, she repeated, her voice taking on a dangerous tone. Margaret, let me make something clear. This boy and his mother have given me something you never offered in 20 years of marriage to my late husband, a real family. Genuine companionship. Love without financial conditions. Margaret made one last desperate attempt. Victoria, please think about what Robert would say. Robert, Victoria smiled, and this time the smile held genuine sadness. Robert despised you, Margaret. He told me several times that you only showed up when you needed money. And he left very clear instructions on what to do if you tried to blackmail or manipulate me after his death. She walked over to the safe built into the wall and typed in the combination. From inside, she took out a sealed envelope. A letter from my late husband, written 3 months before he died, describing exactly this type of situation and authorizing me to completely cut off anyone who tried to exploit me during my mourning. Margaret tried to grab the envelope, but Victoria pushed it away. Oh no. This letter is going straight to Patricia Coleman, my new lawyer who specializes in fraudulent will contests. Along with all the recordings, photos, and evidence of your attempted conspiracy. David Wellington finally found his voice. Victoria, maybe we can come to an agreement. Agreement? Victoria laughed genuinely. David, you conspired to have me forcibly committed to a psychiatric hospital using a bought-off doctor. The only agreement we'll have is when the Bar Association decides how long you'll be suspended. Dr. Mitchell tried again to head for the door, but this time it was Carmen who blocked his way. Doctor, Carmen said, her voice trembling with contained anger, you were willing to separate a child from his family just for money. You are not leaving this house until the police arrive. As if on cue, the sound of sirens began to approach. Victoria checked her watch. It must be the IRS investigators, she said casually. When Jonathan discovered your financial losses, Margaret, we thought it prudent to report some inconsistencies in your tax returns for the past 5 years. Margaret collapsed into an armchair, finally understanding the magnitude of her defeat. It wasn't just the money she had lost, it was her freedom, her reputation, her social standing, everything. How? She whispered, looking as if she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Victoria sat down gracefully in front of her. Margaret, you made the classic mistake of the greedy. You believed that age means weakness and that loneliness means vulnerability. But you forgot that I ran an empire for decades alongside Robert. You forgot that I survived hostile takeover attempts, unfair competition, and corrupt politicians. The paramedics, realizing there would be no hospitalization, began to pack up their equipment with visible relief. And Margaret, Victoria added, her voice now soft but relentless, the irony is that if you had simply visited me regularly, if you had shown genuine affection, if you had accepted Carmen and Kevin as part of the family, you would have remained the beneficiary of the will. Your own greed and prejudice destroyed the inheritance you so coveted. When the police entered the mansion, they found a surreal scene, an elegant elderly woman serving juice to a child while calmly explaining how she had dismantled a conspiracy to steal her fortune and autonomy. Meanwhile, 3 devastated adults waited to be arrested for attempted fraud, extortion, and illegal practice of medicine. Watching Margaret being handcuffed while still trying to argue about family traditions and social inadequacies, Victoria realized something profound. True justice was not in her sister-in-law's imprisonment, but in the discovery that true family has no specific color, social class, or surname. It only has love, loyalty, and mutual respect. 2 years later, the Whitmore mansion had been completely transformed. What was once a silent mausoleum now echoed with laughter during Sunday dinners, where Kevin, now 10 years old, told Victoria about his school adventures, and she listened with the genuine interest of a doting grandmother. Carmen had officially become the property manager, with a salary commensurate with her dedication. Kevin attended one of the best private schools in the city, his talents in mathematics flourishing under Victoria's constant encouragement. Margaret Pierce was serving a 3-year sentence for attempted fraud and conspiracy. Her house had been sold to pay the fines, and her former elite social circles shunned her like a pariah. Dr. Mitchell lost his medical license permanently, while David Wellington faced disciplinary proceedings that would end his legal career. "Aunt Victoria," Kevin said during dinner, "my teacher wants to meet you. She said she's never seen a child so confident in presentations." Victoria smiled, remembering the shy boy who had sat timidly at her table years ago. "Of course, dear. It would be an honor." Carmen watched the scene from the kitchen door, still amazed at the turn their lives had taken. It wasn't just financial security, it was the genuine sense of belonging she had never imagined possible. Jonathan Myers had become a regular visitor, bringing reports on the growing educational foundation Victoria had created for underprivileged children. "Over 100 scholarships approved this year," he announced during a visit. "Your legacy extends far beyond this house." Victoria looked around the table, Kevin doing his homework, Carmen organizing foundation papers, Jonathan discussing new social projects. It was exactly the family she had always dreamed of having but never knew how to find. The lesson was crystal clear: Margaret had lost a fortune because she couldn't see beyond the color of a child's skin. Her greed and prejudice blinded her to what really mattered: character, loyalty, and genuine love. Victoria had learned that true family is not defined by blood or last name, but by who chooses to stand by her side in difficult times. Kevin and Carmen not only filled the void in her life, they made her a better, more generous, and infinitely happier person. When Margaret tried to destroy this family out of pure prejudice, she didn't realize she was attacking the only thing Victoria truly valued. And that sealed her own fate. True wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in whom we choose to love. If this story touched your heart and showed you how prejudice can destroy even the most powerful, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true family transcends any social, racial, or economic barrier.